Hitchhiker Part 2. James noticed the precipitation was not sleet but freezing rain. Georgia was noted for ice storms that would sometimes be so thick it would bring several of the transmission electrical lines crashing down. The way the rain was beginning to freeze in the corner of the Volkswagen window, James was thinking they were in the first phase of an ice storm. During an ice storm, if it started to freeze on the highway, it was impossible to stay in the road, and if you came to a hill, braking was impossible. You could see sleet when it started to accumulate on the side of the road, but ice was clear, and sometimes you could not see it until you got out of your automobile after you had already slid into a ditch. Walking and driving on the pavement covered with ice was impossible. James saw a small market with a gravel parking lot. He motioned for Kathy to pull over into the parking lot, while at the same time telling her they were probably in an ice storm situation. Kathy nodded her head in approval as she pulled her Volkswagen off the road. By the time she parked, a film of ice was covering the front of the car, and you could see it clinging to the trees and electrical and telephone lines. James told Kathy it looked like they would be stranded in the parking lot until the temperature warmed up enough to melt the ice. Kathy appeared to be satisfied with this situation because she was enjoying the conversation. James was thinking the same thing. James was comfortable with his new coat that Joe had given him. It still smelled like chewing tobacco, so James told Kathy how he acquired it. Kathy turned the interior light on and looked in the back seat of her Volkswagen. She retrieved a jacket and maneuvered to a position where she could put the jacket on. This gave James the ability to see Kathy more clearly, and he was thinking she was a beautiful girl. Kathy asked James why was he out hitchhiking, because he did not appear as someone down on his luck. James told her it was something he always wanted to do. He always assumed it would be a way to get the flavor of America. Case in point, if it was not for hitchhiking, I would never have met the ghost lady. Kathy continued to give James the third degree. He told her about recently getting out of the Army, where he was in electronic repair. His family back in Waycross owned a television sales and repair business, so he was working there before starting this hitchhiking journey. James could hardly believe how comfortable he was with Kathy. Usually, when you met a girl, there was a period where you were not 100% comfortable, but this was not the case with Kathy. James felt like he had known her from childhood, and her voice was like poetry. In fact, sometimes she spoke in poetic phrases. When she pulled into the parking lot, she said, "Sleet and snow, as it blows, let ice be the beginning of it all." Although it did not rhyme, James was thinking how unusually poetic this ghost girl was. It was as if time stopped as Kathy and James sat in her Volkswagen talking. Kathy began to move closer to James, and he had the feeling she wanted to kiss him, and he wanted to kiss her. How could he say goodbye and continue the hitchhiking journey to Sneedville, Tennessee, after meeting someone he did not want to lose? It could be a beginning or an ending, and James did not want his association with Kathy to end. Just as James placed his hand on the side of Kathy's face and started to pull her to him, he heard it. He knew what it was because of the high RPM coming from 2 aircraft engines. Someone was flying in this weather, picking up ice, and the aircraft was struggling to maintain altitude. By the sound of the engines, James could tell the pilot had the engines at the max power, and as the engine noise became louder, he knew the airplane was losing the battle with the ice. James opened the door and got out of the Volkswagen just as a Beechcraft Travel Air touched down in a pasture field on the other side of the road. The Beechcraft went between 2 large trees, ripping the wings off and igniting the wing fuel tanks. The fuselage continued to slide to a stop on the other side of the trees. James was thinking if the fuselage did not hit anything, the people on board probably survived. As soon as James started to cross the road, he fell. The road was an ice skating rink, so he had to crawl to the other side. Once in the dirt and grass, he had enough traction to run to the fuselage, which was upside down in the field. A man about the age of James was trying to crawl out of the fuselage. James ran up to the man and asked him if anyone else was in the airplane. The pilot had a laceration on his head, and the blood on his face made him look more injured than he was. The pilot told James he was ferrying the airplane to Florida, and he was the only one on board. He told James he believed he had a broken ankle. By this time, some of the locals that heard the crash was arriving on the scene. Once they had the pilot stabilized and away from the airplane fuselage, James started back to where Kathy and her Volkswagen was parked. The Volkswagen was gone. James crawled and slid across the road where he and Kathy had parked. James looked around to see if he had confused the location. It was the correct location, but the Volkswagen was gone. James stood motionless in the location, trying to figure out how the Volkswagen was able to leave the area. James walked over to the market and sat down on a wooden bench in front of the store. Some of the locals had made a makeshift stretcher and was carrying the pilot to one of the farmhouses because no one could use a vehicle on the ice-covered roads. You can hear an airplane. One of the locals slid over the road and walked up to where James was sitting. James asked him if he saw an old Volkswagen sitting in the parking lot when he came up to see the airplane crash? The man shook his head no. James knew the ice would melt just as soon as the sun came up. He decided to sit in this location until things started to move again. He could not get Kathy off his mind, and he was wondering how and why would she leave without saying something to him. He was wondering how she was able to drive away more than the reason why. The owners of the market came and opened the market after the ice melted. By this time, electric crews were repairing the transmission lines. The telephone line to the market was intact, and after purchasing something to eat, he asked the owner if he could use the phone to phone his sister in Waycross. Most of the people coming in to shop at the market found out about James seeing the crash and helping the pilot out of the wreckage. They wanted to hear a first-hand account, and James began to tell them all he remembered. James wanted to ask some of the locals about the albino girl and the Volkswagen, but for some reason he was afraid to ask. James' sister pulled up to the market in James' station wagon. He told her he would drive her back to Waycross, but he was coming back to the area of the airplane crash. James did not tell his sister about Kathy. He continued to hesitate to mention anything about her because he did not want to get one of those ghost replies. James would spend the night in Waycross and drive back up to the market the next day. By now, the television people were at the market interviewing people. When the outside video footage of the market came on the screen, James saw Kathy's Volkswagen sitting in the exact location where they were when the airplane crashed. James could not believe what he was seeing. When James pulled his station wagon into the market parking lot, he sat in his vehicle a long time before getting out. When he walked into the market, the owner recognized him as one of the first people on the scene of the crash. James was wanting to ask the market owner about the Volkswagen in the parking lot, but he did not want the answer he felt like he would get. Then he saw Joe, the gas station attendant near the cigarette counter, purchasing a pack of cigarettes. James walked up to him and said he could have the jacket back that belonged to one of the guys that worked at the station. Joe appeared surprised to see James and said if he did not need the jacket anymore, he would place it back on the hanger at the service station. Then Joe wanted to know if James hitched a ride at the stop sign Joe had dropped him off at. James told Joe a lady picked him up in an old Volkswagen. Joe almost dropped his pack of cigarettes, and he said, "You got to be joking." James told Joe, yes, he was joking. Joe appeared relieved, but not James. James was beginning to think he had stumbled into something beyond his capabilities to understand.